We have a very special guest on today's show, Cami Orange. She, her, is a boundary coach and author of the book Say the Thing. Cami identifies as a fat, queer, autistic, white, cis woman and has 17 years of experience helping people set boundaries and speak up in defense of others. Cami has been featured in BuzzFeed, CNN, Upworthy, morning television, podcasts, and has over 300,000 followers on social media. Cami is the boundary coach to go to. I have read this new book, and it is absolutely phenomenal. Let's get into it today with Cami. We have Cami Orange in the house today to talk about your new book, Say the Thing. I love that it's orange, like your name, like your beautiful top. I absolutely was cracking up when I read this book. At first, I was ready to be like all very serious. Like, okay, we have to set boundaries. I'm going to sit and I'm going to learn about why boundaries are an act of self-love, and I'm going to learn so much. And I did, but what I didn't expect was the humor, because you and I had not met yet at that point. And after having met you, of course, now I understand why. But I love that you make boundary setting almost fun. Like, it's like a challenge, and also this can be fun. Um, this can be more than just an act of self-love. It can be a fun act of self-love. It's fantastic. Congratulations. I'm so excited for you. And I'm so excited for all of us who get to get a hold of this book and learn the thing. So tell us how Say the Thing came about.
It has been so exciting to see this book finally exist because I knew for a long time I wanted to write a book, and I was kind of like, oh, I'll self publish, it will be a thing. And then I was doing really well on TikTok, and back in, let's see, 22, and I had somebody reach out to me, the senior acquisitions editor at Hay House, and she sent me an email and she's like, "Hey, I follow you on TikTok. I love your work. Have you considered doing a book?" And my favorite part is that she sent a little like paragraph in her email of like, "This is what Hay House is, blah, blah, blah." And I was like, I know what Hay House is. I grew up on Hay House books. Like, like I am very
Yeah.
familiar. And so she sent me this email, and right after she sent me the email, I had a video go viral. Got, almost 2 million views. I got covered in BuzzFeed. I got like, the media stuff happened, but it happened after she emailed me. And so it was interesting that all of these things kind of had similar timing. And so then when I put the book proposal in, because before she was like, "Oh, well, if you put together a book proposal, I'll send it to my team. It needs to have like your media appearances." And I was like, "I don't have media appearances."
Yeah.
And then I did. And so I had, a listing, put it together, initial chapters, and they loved it. And so they bought the book. And then I wrote the book and we edited the book. And so that was all 2023. And so I had to take a break from making videos because I only have so much bandwidth. Like, and so I focused on the book, finished that, and now I'm back making videos, and the book exists in the world, and I love it. I'm having so much fun seeing people enjoy the book.
It's so much fun. And, I love that you brought up the social media part, because that is something that is so prevalent right now. I mean, I think it's over 60% as of right now, at least, of people are on social media. How do we set boundaries on social media? Because people are mean. Some people are really mean sometimes.
I think a couple of things to keep in mind when setting boundaries on social media. Number one is we have a sampling issue. It makes me think of when I worked at an electrical company and I was sitting, answering phones, and I could hear the techs in the lobby, and they're like, "Oh, homeowners are so stupid. They're so stupid. They tried to install a ceiling fan and it ripped out of their ceiling, and then they had to call us, or they tried to do this and it didn't work and they had to call us." And one of the techs spoke up and he's like, only homeowners who couldn't do it themselves call an electrician. Like, all the homeowners who just went down to Home Depot and figured it out never called. And so your perception that homeowners are stupid is really inaccurate because we're only interacting with homeowners who cannot do their own electrical work. There are lots of homeowners who do their own. And so I think the same thing happens online is we have this perception that like, oh, people are so mean online. But, like, we're having a sampling issue that people who get a lot of dopamine, they get a lot of, that rage dopamine from being mean online are overrepresented online. The vast majority of people, they watch videos, like the numbers, and I know this because I make online content and I have for the last several years. The numbers of how many people saw the video versus how many people comment on the video versus how many people share or interact with the video are vastly different. And so let's say a video gets 10,000 views and I get 200 mean comments. And I might be like, oh, everyone was so mean. No, 200 people who get their rocks off on being mean
Mhm.
left a comment. 10,000 people saw this video, 9,000, whatever that would be. You know what I'm trying to say? 800 people didn't leave a comment. And so it's a sampling issue. So that's the first thing to keep in mind when we're setting boundaries online is we're interacting with a very, very small percentage of humanity. Like antisocial behavior, like being mean is it's so weird. Like it's aberrant. It's aberrant behavior. Most people are kind. Most people are lovely. It's weird when people are not. And so that's the first thing to keep in mind. The other thing is that the online disinhibition effect. This is like a studied research thing that people, it's similar to road rage, where we forget they're other humans in the cars and we see them as objects. And so we're like, oh, I'm trying to get somewhere and these objects are in my way. No, those are people. Like, we're not stuck in traffic, we are the traffic. Like, we are all in this together. And so all of that happens, and so when we're setting boundaries online to be like, "Hey, you seem like you're having a bad day. Are you okay?" Like, "Oh," or I just block and delete very frequently because they are there to get a rise out of me, and you know what? I'm not on there to feed into their rage dopamine needs. They can go somewhere else. And so I feel no hesitation to not respond, to block, delete, and to use that liberally because that is such a small percentage of the people interacting with content online.
To use that liberally, I love that. And you're right, like putting it in perception. That's why I had to correct myself, even say, some people are mean sometimes. And yeah, that could be the one place that people say, "Oh, I'm just gonna be mean today in this place because of that disinhibition." Like, I don't feel like I have to hold back in any kind of way. I'm not inhibiting myself in any kind of way, in other words, is what that person might be thinking. And also realizing that you do have agency to who is going to show up in your comments to some extent, particularly on some of these other on some other platforms where, we really can just say, you gotta ask to be, this is a private account. You have to ask to be part of it. So for some people, it might be that. And I know that with this election year that we're in right now, the time that we're recording is 2024, and this particular election year is going to be a hard year for a lot of folks. And social media is where a lot of this shows up. That's part of the space that makes it hard for folks. And so it might just be like for me personally, I know I'm like, I have to have this boundary with myself of how much exposure I give myself to social media. It's not just about setting boundaries with other people. I know for me at least, it's setting boundaries with myself. And so when we go into this new election year that we're going into, that's going to be difficult for a lot of people, particularly folks who have historically marginalized or minoritized identities, like myself, like you, like many of us. This year is I'm going to venture to say paramount in that we set certain boundaries. Um, when we're talking about people from marginalized communities. Well, let me share a story first. So it was the end of 2016. I took my dad to a doctor's appointment in a rural part of the South. We walk into the office. There are a handful of people in there. They're all congregated together in one little corner, and they hear my dad's accent, thick Egyptian accent, as he checks in. And they are looking us up and down. They are looking at each other. And then they very loudly start talking about immigrants coming in and taking over all of these jobs. And I did not feel physically safe at that point. I literally went into like a freeze response, but then also a fawn response. There's like 6 F's. There's fight, flight, freeze, flop, fawn. I can't remember all of them, but they're all there. And I went into a freeze response, and then I went into a fawn response where I just started smiling in this very strange way that actually did not feel natural to me. And they kept talking and they kept staring and they did not look away when they looked at us. And it got louder and louder and louder. And so at one point, I just got up and went to the restroom. It was a flight response. And then I came back and sat down. Meanwhile, they are sitting in a doctor's office of someone who emigrated from India. They themselves are going to see a doctor who is Indian. And that was ironic in itself. But for people who don't feel safe in a particular moment, one of the things that I always wondered is how do I set a boundary? What do I do in that moment? Because I end up going home kind of carrying the shame of, oh, I didn't say anything. I didn't stand up for my dad. I didn't stand up for myself. But also, like, I didn't feel safe. That has always been one that's been really tricky, I find, for a lot of folks.
Thank you for sharing that story. I think primarily safety first. I believe that people who have those experiences, like you, like me, there's innate awareness. Like I trust our instincts to be like, is it safe to speak up right now? And sometimes it is, and sometimes it's not. And so there is no shame, at least from my perspective, there's no shame in doing the safest thing, which in that case might have been to be silent. And
Mhm.
so when I teach about boundaries, there's kind of like the four roads that you can take. The first one is you avoid, like you stay silent. You're like, do you know what? I'm just opting out of this whole thing. That's, similar to what we were talking about with online social media comments. We're just blocking this and moving on, right? Like we're just not engaging with this. And that is a valid option. Sometimes that is the safest thing to do. And then on the other end of the four, the most extreme would be having a really big response. And that's complaining to the doctor and getting them kicked out. That's screaming and yelling. That's, whatever the case may be in that situation. Like some people, like we said, social media, they turn off their accounts. Like that's in interpersonal relationships. That's where we call the police. Like it's a very extreme, big action, big response. But in between, I think that there are using our words and then using slightly louder words, being indirect and then being direct. And an indirect comment in that space might be turning to your dad and saying loudly so they can hear you because it's not a very large waiting room. They can hear you. I am so glad that Dr. So and so immigrated to this country so he can treat all of this rural population who don't have their own doctors. Isn't it so nice that there are immigrants who bring their education into rural communities who need them? That would be a more it sounds direct, but it's more indirect in the sense that you're speaking to your dad, you're not speaking to them specifically. Direct would be, "Are you looking at me? Can I help you with something? Do you do you have a question for me? It seems like you really wanna have a conversation. What is that conversation?" That would be direct, right? Like, that's the very forceful, "Let's have that conversation." And so, in that situation, you have good instincts and you can trust yourself and be like, "Okay, is it the safest thing to stay quiet? Is it the safest thing to make an indirect comment?" And maybe the indirect would be you tell the doctor when you go back and be like, "Hey, this was what was happening in the waiting room. Can you talk to your front desk staff about how to intervene or interact if people are being weird racists in the waiting room?" Like that might not be your job to solve. That might be the doctor's job to solve and to train his staff better. So, because there would be a power in the receptionist or the doctor saying, "Hey, that's not okay," because then it's not about you. And there's a lot, it's the bystander effect, right? Like there's so much power in bystanders.
I love that because in my mind, I've always tried, especially being a therapist, I've always tried to avoid being what I perceive as being passive aggressive. But what you're saying is that I love the reframe on that, that doesn't feel performative. It feels legit, right? That it's not that I would be passive aggressive. It's about giving a message indirectly.
Yep.
And we get indirect messages all the time. All the time. If somebody yawns, we say, "Hey, are you tired?" It doesn't necessarily mean that they are, right? But if we hear somebody's belly rumbling or like, "Oh, are you hungry?" We get indirect messages all the time. That's not necessarily a negative thing. And I had not even reading your book, but I read it, but then hearing you puts more more context to it, I guess,
Mhm.
that it's not that I'm being passive aggressive, it's that I'm being indirect and I'm trying to communicate to you almost as politely as I can right now. And I think there's some cultural aspect to that actually too, because there's certain populations and certain cultures, and even within the US in terms of like regionally, that
Mhm.
say setting a boundary is impolite
Mhm.
in some way, like
Yes.
you're being rude.
Yes. There are regions that are more indirect and there are regions that are more direct. And what I find fascinating is that rudeness is really about that specific group, that specific, we want to be part of the group. We want to belong. And so in the doctor's waiting room, they were signaling to you by staring at you that you don't belong because
Mm,
that's not what you do to people who
mhm.
belong in your group. You don't stare at them. That's considered rude. But they're saying you don't belong, so we can do this rude behavior to show you that you are not part of our group. And so it's a
Mm.
form of othering and it's happens mostly subconsciously, but that's why people are rude to people is because they're saying, "Hey, I'm over here, you're over there." And so in the region of the United States that I'm from the Rocky Mountain area. I grew up in a predominantly religious Mormons community. We're over 92% white.
Mhm.
And like I have a very vivid memory of the first time I saw a black family when I was like 7 or 8 years old. Before that point, Mona, I didn't know they came in families, and that sounds horrible, but, like, I'd
Wow.
only ever met black children who had been adopted into all white families. Like, it didn't occur to me
Wow.
in my child brain that, like I remember seeing, like, a mom, a dad, and their kids, and I was like, "Oh, that makes sense." "Oh, okay." And it's a really vivid memory because 'cause I'd never seen a black family before. And so that's weird. Like, that's weird to get to be like 7 or 8 years old and be like, "Oh, black people." Like, that's strange. We have Hispanic people here, but, like, that's pretty much it. And so the boundary phrases that I've developed, I've tried to be really, really conscious of the fact that there are distinct regionalisms that where I come from, similar to the South where they want to be indirect, here it's certain people are allowed to be direct. Men get to be direct, women have to definitely be indirect. And so the communication is different. And that influences how you would set boundaries. And that's why when I put together Say the Thing and there's thousands of boundary scripts, I am very aware that most people won't use those exactly the way they're written because I went for, to the best of my ability, the most direct option because it's easy to soften and it's hard to make an indirect statement more direct if you don't have practice. And so if you're like, "Ooh, that was really direct. I'm not going to say it that way, but maybe I'll soften it and say it this way." And that's why the examples in the book are written the way they are is because I know a lot of people come from indirect regions and they're going
Mhm.
to need to soften that to make it sound like them and to make it fit.
Yeah, or they come from contextual cultures. Like East Asian cultures are going to be more indirect, for example, and being direct is considered very rude. So I love that you do that. And by the way, I have a good friend who lives out in the Midwest, and she's from here, but she, as an adult, moved to the Midwest started a family there, and she said, "My children have literally only met kids of color in the classroom because of, being, 90 some percent white, and having to having to learn how to teach her children about being culturally aware has been a challenge because of the lack of access, and the homogeneity of where they live. And so it's interesting. You could live in a certain region, but if you're working, or if you're working with, or you have friends who are from minoritized or marginalized populations, then the way that you set boundaries need to be adjusted in order to be responsive to that particular person's culture in that way.
For me, that's why I teach boundaries the way I teach them, is that boundaries are about keeping in our lives the people and relationships that we want instead of keeping out what we don't want. Instead of focusing on, oh, I don't want that, I don't want that. It's like, oh, what do I want? And how do I have those
Mhm.
conversations to keep that in my life? And I believe, and in my experience, people can feel that. If I'm saying, hey, could you do that or could you not do that? And we're having I'm setting a boundary with you, we're having a conversation. Maybe I didn't say it perfectly. Maybe there was no perfect words
Mhm.
in that situation, but you can tell that I had good intentions. You know that I care about you. And you're like, hey, that came across a little abrupt. What are you trying to say? And then we can move forward from there instead of just saying, oh, I'm cutting it off. I don't want that. And then the energy is pushing away instead of trying to bring in. I love people so much, I'm willing to be uncomfortable and set boundaries to keep those relationships.
Setting boundaries can really be a bridge to belonging in
Yes.
that way. In the same way that you're saying that, as I was sitting in that doctor's office, that they were staring at me, being rude as a way to other and isolate us, to say, we are us and you are you, we are not the same. And that created isolation, which is the biggest barrier to belonging, which is the opposite of belonging. Setting boundaries can actually invite people into your world and create more connection. I love the story that you share in your book about your roommate in the toilet.
I wanted to have a positive experience living with this person, and I knew that if I didn't say something, then I would resent them and it would start to infect all of our other interactions that I was like, "Ooh, I don't like them." Every time I interact with them, "Ooh, I don't like them." And then eventually, we're not going to have a good living situation. And so to walk down the hall, knock on their door and be like, "Hey, excuse me, will you please be more careful about not leaving little drops of pee on the toilet seat when you're in there? That would be super helpful. Thanks." To a grown adult. Like that was it's not my favorite interaction. Like that was awkward. Yes. And I felt awkward and they felt awkward, but it solved it. And then our interactions were good from there.
Mhm.
Like, and I think the follow-up piece that I don't know if this made it in the book, is that I continued to be warm. I continued to be kind. I continued to be positive in my interactions because I wanted to signal, hey, yes, I set this boundary. Yes, I asked for this thing. And yes, that was awkward for both of us, but I like you. I'm going to continue to like you. This is not a deal breaker. Like, we belong. We are still roommates. We're still friends. We are still like in this, living situation together, as opposed to saying, "You're a horrible person, stop peeing on the seat," or "I don't wanna live with you anymore," and which is pushing away.
Yeah, it's interesting because we can get in these situations where we're almost taught like we shouldn't have to say certain things, that people should know what your needs are. And then we can get angry when we have to state our needs. Um, and that need might include setting some kind of boundary, like saying, hey, when you do this, it impacts me this way. And it's interesting because it's like we get angry that we have to let somebody know who we are and let them in on our experience of them. But what is a relationship without that kind of communication? I mean, we have to be able to have these kind of conversations with folks and not be pissed off about it. Relationships inherently require boundaries to be put in place. And if we can reframe it in terms of thinking of it as letting someone understand what our lived experience is or what our experience of them is, then that really can create more bonding between people. Like, oh, it impacts you that way. Now I understand this thing a little bit deeper about you. And I love how you have these different scripts in the book to help people not just learn how to well, you have very specific scripts in terms of helping people learn how to respond to different kinds of situations, microaggressions towards ourselves, microaggressions towards other people, so for allies, for example, and then how you have it for a number of different things. Like, I love the ones about disability, even too, particularly as somebody who is in a body that at times has limitations. And I use a cane most of the time, sometimes crutches, sometimes I'm in a wheelchair. And I can see sometimes the looks change around me, people not looking me in the eyes. And I almost set a boundary just by speaking up and talking to them. Like, you're not going to look away from me when but you're looking at my wheelchair, but you're glancing away from looking in my eyes. And so I will look them straight in the eye and address them politely and strike up conversation. But that is my way of saying that's like setting a boundary for my wheelchair, which is an extension of my body. And it feels like you're just staring at my body and not looking at me in the eye, which is not comfortable to me whatsoever. And so I love that you have these scripts in here for so many different situations like that, but also from an empowerment standpoint, teaching people how to create their own scripts. So, can you tell us a little bit, Cami, about the different kinds of situations in which people might create scripts for themselves?
Absolutely. I think that a lot of boundary content that I've seen is organized by relationship type. These are the boundaries you set with your partner. These are the boundaries you set with your mom. These are the boundaries you set with your coworkers. And for me, I have not found that to be effective because I do my very best to be kind and authentic and very bold with everyone in my life. And it's, my privilege of being self employed. So I don't have to interact with certain, I don't have a boss. I am the boss, So I
Mhm.
do see that. But it didn't when they're like, "Oh, these are the boundaries set with your partner," I was like, "That's not the type of relationship I have with my partner." And so I framed it instead as public and private, in the moment or
Okay.
later. And that framework says, "All right, in this moment, like we're in public and we're having an interaction, let's say my partner and I need to set a boundary. I would handle that differently than if later we got home and I was like, "Hey, when we were out in public and this thing happened, could you not do that again?" And changing it based on the immediacy of the moment as well as how public or private it is. Is this a one-on-one conversation or is this happening in front of other people? That's where I change my scripts. And so the goal of Say the Thing is to teach people this boundary language because it is a type of language, it is a vocabulary. And once you kind of develop this fluency, you're able to, in the moment, like I'm not sitting there being like, oh, what do I say? What do I say? What do I say? Because I have enough practice that I'm like, oh, this is what I'm going to say. Like, hey, will you please do that? Or hey, will you please not do that? And there's an ease to it versus I think for a lot of people, if you don't grow up learning this, you do have to practice. And that's where the frameworks in the book allow you to sit down and be like, all right, I was at work and my coworker commented for the 10,000th time, oh, like, your hair is so pretty. Like, can I touch your hair? How do I want to respond next time? And they can look up at the resources in the book. They can come up with their own framework and say, all right, disruptor statement transition, like, oh, please don't keep asking me about my hair. Anyway, about the Jones report and then getting back into it. And so they can write their own script and they can practice it and find something that fits that situation. Because as you mentioned, you are an ambulatory wheelchair user, and some people inevitably make the same comments. I have a lot of friends who are ambulatory wheelchair users, meaning like some days they use a wheelchair, some days they use a cane or
Mhm.
crutches or whatever. And inevitably, they're at the grocery store, they're getting something, they stand up from their wheelchair to grab something and sit back down, and someone goes, "Oh, are you cured?" And it happens all the time. And it happens all the time. And so it's like, okay, maybe in that moment you didn't know what to say, but you can go home, pull out your copy of Say the Thing, and look at options of what to say, come up with your own script, and be prepared because you know somebody will say it again. If somebody said it once, they're going to say it again. And inevitably, you need to be prepared. And so you start to develop this vocabulary based on the situations in your life.
And have you heard people apologize for setting the boundary? Like, "Oh, I'm sorry, but I when you touch my hair," and they're, like, uncomfortable with it, and they start apologizing when they're trying to set a boundary.
That definitely happens. I encourage people to not do that. So
Mhm.
I would say my students and clients, I try to say, we don't need to apologize for setting boundaries. And
Yeah.
the reason for that is we live in an increasingly diverse world. And so when we live in, a homogenous family group, everybody kind of knows, oh, when mom is sniffing, that means that the trash stinks and she's expecting the brother to take it out, right?
Mm.
Everybody knows that. So then flash forward, somebody from that family marries into another family and they're sniffing, meaning the trash stinks and I want, a partner to take it out. Partner didn't come from a family where people sniffing means the trash stinks and they're supposed to take it out. They don't know that that is the cue. And so then there's frustration. And so developing language to say, will you please take the trash out? Like, that's important because the more diverse our world becomes, the more we need to be explicit because I cannot
Mhm.
assume in any interaction that you have the same background as me, that you understand the same cues as me.
Mhm.
And so to continue to build belonging, we must communicate. We must say more clearly, hey, when you said this, like you seemed like you were sniffing a lot. Do you have a cold? Are you okay? Oh, that means the trash? Oh, I didn't know that. Let's have that conversation. And you had said a little bit ago that, people get angry when they have to communicate those things. And I think it comes from this is, theory according to Cami Orange. I call it a micro rejection. Just like there's microaggressions, a micro rejection is like they feel that like, ooh, maybe I don't belong. Ooh, we're not connected because I'm having to explain something that to me is obvious. And so to try to communicate things in such a kind and direct way that says, hey, we're okay. We belong. We're connected. And I also need you to use your words and tell me when you want the trash taken out because I didn't know that sniffing meant that.
It makes so much sense, Cami, because I think the underlying assumption has to be I belong here. I belong in this grocery store, I belong in this community, I belong in this world. I belong in this relationship. I belong in this body. And that has to be the underlying assumption. Instead of seeking it, you have to claim it. You have to claim your own belonging in that moment and then go from there. And what that looks like is very much just echoing back what you were just saying is that this is my partner. My partner loves me. We have a great relationship. And also, I need to communicate what sniffing means to me or that I don't like the smell of bad trash and how it impacts me. And that maybe like legit, this is a true story. My husband literally ran into a brick wall and hit himself right over his eyebrow. This is many, many, maybe 15 years ago, over 15 years ago. And it impacted his olfactory senses. He can't smell things as much. And when I tell you, we used to have this exact same argument where I would be like, why does the trash smell so bad? I've been working all day. I haven't been downstairs. You've been downstairs all day. Why didn't you take the trash down? This is disgusting. And he's like, I'm sorry, I didn't know. I didn't know. I'm like, how did you not know that it stinks? And it's like, it's such a dramatic thing as opposed to my partner and I have a loving, kind, respectful relationship, act accordingly. You know what I mean? Instead of just expecting that from him, also expect that from myself. And when I do that, it actually gives my own. I feel like I'm celebrating myself in terms of self belonging when I am setting boundaries respectfully to my partner whom I love. This is in the private setting, because I know there's the public and the private. And so I feel like I'm claiming my own self-belonging in that I'm staying true to who I am and also recognizing that my partner and I have this great relationship where I feel like I belong in this relationship and I don't take that as a rejection and can say, "Hey, maybe when you are cutting broccoli, which smells just fine in the moment, but you leave the room and you come back and it stinks to somebody else, maybe when you cut broccoli, no matter how much trash is in there, if even if it's very little, just go ahead and take it out or put it in a smaller bag and take it out because it's gonna stink even if you can't smell it." That is like helping him also feel like I'm not rejecting him as well. And so that is where I think these boundaries can serve as a bridge to belonging in so many different capacities, even if that is just yourself within a community and you're experience something as a micro rejection. Claim that space. Claim that space and give that back to yourself is what I'm hearing from you instead of like waiting for someone to accept you or perceiving something as a rejection.
The main premise of my book and the reason I felt so motivated to write it was I've noticed, and I'm sure you've come across this in the world, that people who are not oriented towards belonging, they are not worried about rejecting others. And so they will just say stuff. They will just say things that hurt feelings or are unkind or whatever that is. And so often I think people don't want to set boundaries because their only experience with someone directly saying that's not okay is people who I call them jerks, but jerks.
Mhm.
And they're like, "Oh, I don't wanna be a jerk. If I set boundaries, that will make me a jerk. That will be rude, that will be mean, that will be," because that is their only experience. And so a big part of my work is being an example and making videos and content to say, "Hey, it's possible to do this in, like, a super kind, loving way that builds good relationships." I'm not
Mhm.
being a jerk when I ask for the trash to be taken out. I'm
Mhm.
saying, "You matter to me and I matter to me, and this is something that makes our lives better. Is this something that you can do with me or not?" And then we can have a negotiation. And a lot of that work has come from my own disability experience and then also knowing people with disabilities because accommodations, competing accommodations, like if you need noise to function and I need quiet to function, like how do we find a solution that works for both of us? Do headphones exist in this scenario? And the ability to navigate and with kindness negotiate, say, "Hey, what you need is valid and what I need is also valid." And I'm not willing to have resentment in our relationship where like you get the noise you want and I'm going to sit here being very, very angry that you're making noise. And instead I'm going to say, "Hey, let's find a solution that works for both of us. It's possible." And so instead of framing it as like, "Oh, if I set boundaries, I'm a jerk," it's more like, you know what? We all need accommodations. We're humans that exist like in a society
Yeah.
together. We have to talk it out. There is a solution and we can find a way.
I love that you that you bridge that together in terms of like creating better relationships and boundaries because most people inherently think of that as the opposite based on what we've been taught in society too, that some people's needs are more important than others. And if you are in that part that, in that category of people who have been othered, then it can be more difficult. It's like you were saying, some people have not been oriented to belonging. I also see that as some people have inherently, because of the identities that they were born into, have have been given belonging without question, where other people have not. The thing with relationships too is really interesting. I think I shared an example with you recently. My husband and I are both neurodivergent, and it presents sometimes very similarly and other times very differently. So there are times where he has to get up and move his body physically, or he feels like he's going to jump out of his skin. And there are times where I also feel that way. But there was a particular day recently where he had that moment and I was having a very different moment where I needed everything around me to be very still I could listen to him, but I could not have things moving around me because it was very overstimulating for my nervous system. And for his, he needed to move. So I was putting on makeup to get ready for the day, and he had a lot of things he needed to get out of his system and tell me about, before we got our day started. And he was like, "I'm sorry, babe. I got to move. I got to move." And I was like, "Okay." And so it really was just like a quick pause in my mind. And I just had to tell myself the truth of what I was feeling, which was, hell no, I cannot watch you do that. And so what I said was, okay. And I am not able to watch a lot of movement right now. So if it's okay with you, I would like to suggest that I turn my back to you and I'm going to move my mirror to the other side and I'm going to put my makeup on while you are off back behind me to my side. The mirror was angled just right. And I'm going to put on my makeup, but I'm not going to be able to look at you. But you can still talk to me as long as you understand that I'm listening. And he said, that works for me. And boom, just like that, I set the boundary, which was also boundaries include like saying my needs for that in that
Mhm.
particular moment. He respected it. I recognized first and foremost that, again, this person and I have a great relationship. We already have that sense of connection and belonging with one another. And so I actually felt very embraced, very celebrated by him by being, and I felt like I was embracing and celebrating and seeing myself by naming things in that moment. And so it actually increased my sense of connection, which thereby increased my sense of trust in this person. It's almost like setting boundaries begets setting more boundaries. So now I know I can continue to say what my needs are. So I love the way that you frame all of that because I can tell you from my own experience it's been true. And as soon as and that had just happened right before I read your book by the way and I was like, "Oh, it works. I did the thing. I said the thing." And so it really, really does work. So I ask everybody this, Cami, because not to put people on the spot, because I truly, truly am interested to hear how do you define belonging or how do you conceptualize belonging?
I my first interaction with belonging as like, oh, this is a human need is definitely Maslow's hierarchy. And the idea that, our physiological needs can be met and our safety needs can be met, but then we need community. We need people. And for me, I think a lot about how humans are the dominant collaborative species on the planet. We're the physically largest collaborative species of our type, and I think if I think if certain species of bugs and ants were bigger, they would rule the world. But here we are. So I we all exist in this connection. And I'm a spiritual person, that's my background, and I believe that we are all little essentially sparks of light that came into existence when the universe was born. And we meet people who their spark of light was in proximity to us when, all of the sparks of light began. And so as we go throughout life, we go, "Oh, hello. It's so good to see you again." And we see that person in multiple lifetimes throughout time. And so to me, belonging is recognizing and acknowledging that connection, recognizing and acknowledging like I'm the spark of light, you're the spark of light, and we get to rebump into each other. We are now in proximity again. And how do we nurture that? How do we make that as beautiful as it was in the beginning and let it continue? And sometimes that's a short moment, and sometimes that's a lifetime or anywhere in between. And so to me, belonging is this idea of nurturing that connection, that spark between humans.
And you definitely bring the spark because you're such a beam of light. I mean, you just shine so brightly through your voice and seeing your face, and all of that comes through in your book, through your words, without your even having to be present. You're right here with us in this book. And I absolutely am so honored to have been able to spark right here with you because you are such a delightful person and you're brilliant. And we are so lucky to have you in this realm. Thank you so much, Cami, for being here today. We're so grateful. And I know so many people are going to really, really learn from this book and be able to create more connection within themselves and in the world around them just from what you're sharing here. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mona.